we're going to get hands-on pretty much right away. So I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Christopher Gervais. One of my partners at Consensus, Derek, is going to be driving today. And Derek, if we can skip forward, we're just going to quickly go through these. So we work with Consensus. We're basically just old hands at Drupal and related technologies. We really try to take a holistic approach when looking at the projects that we take on. And our focus is very much on the public sector and social enterprises, nonprofits, and organizations of that sort, though we do take the occasional corporate client as well. Can you move forward, Derek? Speaking of which, here's a bunch of those clients. I won't dwell on this, but a lot of our work recently has been with both federal, provincial, and now soon upcoming some municipal governments. Among others, we work with Nick at Ontario Digital Services on some of their recent work. And I just noticed that they're not on that page, so we're going to
indeed this page, right?
Sorry, Nick. So basically, what we're going to do here is kind of two things. We're going to give some context to this project, which was, it's an ongoing project. We recently had the first release within the scope of the project. It's a very interesting project with a lot of sort of unique challenges that I certainly haven't seen previously in this kind of context. So what we want to do is sort of review what that looks like, because that really drove a lot of the stuff we're going to look at on the hands-on part in terms of how the migrations are structured and so forth. Now, when we get into that part, bear in mind, it's going to be a pretty deep dive. We're going to look at some code and some stuff on Derek's terminal and so forth. We'll also look at it from the UI standpoint, but bear in mind, we're just going to go through a bunch of stuff, and then we can answer questions later, or there's going to be a follow-up session next week, or not a follow-up session, but another session on D9 upgrades next week with a panel, and we'll probably be participating in that as well and be able to answer some further questions if stuff comes up between now and then. And of course, just feel free to touch base with us afterwards if there is anything. So that said, the concept here, or the context of this project was a very large website for the government of Canada that had on the order of, I don't know, about 18,000 pages, spread amongst a lot of different information architecture. So what would normally be content types, in this case, they, for a number of reasons, ended up having all of their content, or the vast majority of it, in essentially one big content type. What drove that was some historical components, basically, in that this site's been around for, or like previous editions of it, for a dozen or more years. And at one point, it was basically a static site generator. And at that time, there wasn't any role-based access control within it. So whatever was written and drafted by the content editors would immediately be available. And so in response to that, they essentially created two environments, what they refer to as the work environment and the public environment. So the work environment is where the content editors actually do their editing and drafting of the content. Once it's been approved, then it gets, in that case, pushed to public, and that's when it's actually published to the World Wide Web. That architecture carried over into Drupal. When they built a Drupal 7, they maintained that distinction between this editorial site and the public-facing site. And what that resulted in was a requirement to deploy content from one to the other, which, if you've ever worked on a project like that, you're probably aware is rather complex. It leverages the services module and the content deploy module. It has to do things like synchronizing the UUIDs of content and users and other things between these two environments. And it led to what appears to be this. Some of this is like digital archaeology, right? Sort of figuring out what were the decisions that went into making it the way that it was. The time frame. So one of the challenges that led to this basic page content architecture, where basically all content is in one page that has essentially a CK editor style body, and the content editors would manually craft, or within the CK editor style interface, the HTML that was displayed on the page. So it's kind of an abuse of Drupal, right? It's not the way that Drupal is intended to work. Normally, you would have different content types with fields and so forth, and formatters and different themes and stuff like that. In this case, that did not happen, and part of the reason was this work public dichotomy, where the content had to be pushed from one environment to another, which meant that mappings would have to be created between fields on both sides, and via the services, content deployment, and so forth. The amount of time and effort required to thus craft and maintain content types was quite high. The turnaround time from the end user clients, so the people who actually edited the content, was such that they needed to be able to, within 1 to 2 months of identifying a new content type, be able to have that available to them for public usage. And so the turnaround just didn't allow for that. And eventually the solution that was put in place was this basic page that it was essentially like an online Dreamweaver style environment. So that presented a number of unique challenges when it came to this migration. One of the things we did relatively early on was try to identify whether this work public publication workflow was still required. Drupal has role-based access control and things like Workbench and workflows and stuff that can provide a lot of flexibility around this. And so we were able to get security sign-off on consolidating into a single site. As a result, the way that our migrations had to work was pulling data from both the public site and the work site, because we had different data in each that we needed to preserve, and migrated into a single site. And that presented a number of interesting challenges that we'll look at when we get into some of the migration plugins, especially the source plugins, and the need in some cases to run more migration phases, more steps in migrating content than we might otherwise. There's a number of automation tools available in Drupal 8 and 9 that will sort of analyze a Drupal 7 and try to automate the creation of a lot of these migration configs. We weren't able to leverage that because of this complexity that of the way that the nature of the project. So one of the things we ended up also having to do, because of the way that this worked within this government entity, they had, part of the reason for this work public workflow in the first place was there was content that had to be staged but made public at a very specific time. They were under obligation not to produce it before a certain date, and that everybody would have access to it at the same time, and so forth. So as a result, the security relation in terms of how this environment is managed was quite tight as well, and required VPN access, and VPN access was limited to Windows laptops, and we had a whole rigmarole around that. At the same time, the hosting environment was also being upgraded from essentially virtual machines into a Kubernetes-driven system. So there was a lot going on in parallel. And so one of the things we decided to do relatively early on, and this is a sort of standard practice that we use, was to put together a local development environment that would allow us to essentially run everything we would normally run in a production environment or in a shared development environment, that we would be able to do so locally. And then that actually went a long way in automating the CI components as well. So because we had that running locally on DDEV, which if you're not familiar, I highly recommend you take a look at it. DDEV essentially is a wrapper around Docker Compose, and it allows you to have multiple containers, Docker containers running different components and so forth. And so that actually simplified a lot of the CI components because we could just run those containers in CI as well. We also make heavy use of GNU Make. We have a sort of project that we use called DrumKit, which is just our collection of make files. And that allows us to really simplify what our workflows look like. Any workflow that would be multiple steps, running various drush commands, for example, to achieve a certain goal, we wrap that in a make target, and it becomes, to get started from scratch, you clone the project, and then you run make, start, build, install, and you're done. That's sort of our target is basically anytime a task would take more than 2 commands to accomplish, we wrap it in a make target. That allows us to run the same commands locally as we do in CI, for example, and also then make it easier for the operations people when they're actually running migrations in their cloud environment, that Kubernetes environment, to do the same thing, to run a single command that will do all the steps that are required of that process. So the final thing about this context was in developing this local development environment, normally what we would do if we were just sort of in a greenfields project is we would just build a Drupal 9, right? That's sort of what DDEV does out of the box when you initialize it. In this case, because the migrations were such a core component to the whole project, we also built 2 Drupal 7 fixture sites into this development environment. And so we're running the work site and the public site locally, sanitized copies where we've stripped out all the personal identifiable information and other sensitive information out of the production database. And also stripped down in terms of content because we don't need 17,000 instances to do this. And then parallel to those 2 Drupal 7 sites, we have our Drupal 9 site, and that allows us to run our migrations where we're pulling from the different sources. And you'll see a number of the ways that we've structured the migrations are such as to allow us to kind of swap in those sort of environment variables of like the source host name and things of that nature. So with that, I'm going to jump right into the, actually, can you keep that one up? Well, I've got it here, but that's the one we'll probably come back to occasionally. So I believe, Derek, you have both the fixture sites that we can demo here. I had been not mentioning, but this is a Statistics Canada project. So I guess there's no working around that. So, so this is essentially the front page of Statistics Canada in the private work environment. This is what it looks like. We then have the public equivalent of it. So you'll see that the environment indicator shows whether blue or red, depending on which environment we're working on. And you'll note in the URL that in this case it's fixtures-d7-public.ddev. And in the other one, it would be -public, -work. So these are mostly, so one set of data that we have running in here is the actual content. Another one that we have is sort of crafted content that ensures that we have content. So that's what we're seeing here. This is content that is meant to model the different states that the source content can be in. So in this case, one of the challenges we were facing, as I mentioned earlier, is that all the content is in one content type. And it has a taxonomy that breaks out the different content types, essentially. So we can see here that the actual type listed here is StatCan basic page. But these ones are what we refer to as a DIS module. That's the dissemination team within Statistics Canada that is responsible for this. And we had gone into this with the plan of mapping their internal business logic content types to the content types in our Drupal 9. And so what we need to do is extract from the StatCan basic page all and only, in this case, videos. That was the first content type that we were going to migrate. So we created a bunch of video, StatCan basic page nodes. We flagged them with the appropriate taxonomy and other states, and then we created a bunch of fixtures here that would exercise the various components of the migration. So you'll see the one at the top has a broken video image. A lot of these, the way that these are structured is that there's going to be a player, video player. It's going to have a what's it called, a poster, which is basically like a thumbnail. And we need to migrate that stuff. And what we were discovering as we were running test migrations is some of those would be broken, and we need our migration system to be able to flag it or operate around it without crashing. And so we created all these fixtures into different states, some of which were some error states, some of which were we've got a draft but it hasn't been published, or it has a draft and it has been published and then there's a newer draft. And so that's where we created these fixtures to allow us to model the migration and ensure that post-migration, the new state in the Drupal 9 would properly reflect the content coming in from both the work site and the public site. So if we can take a look quickly at the public site, at the content, we'll see that there's a subset of those same videos. Anything that was published, remember, has been pushed into the public site. Those that were not published don't have equivalents on the public site. And so if there's a newer draft, for example, it's only going to exist on the work site. And so this is what we were trying to determine when we were running our migrations. What was the canonical source of information for all of this in the Drupal 9, right? So as you can imagine, relatively complex overall. Why don't we take a look at the D9, and maybe we can start looking at what we'll start with is maybe starting to look at a very simple example that isn't actually a migration at all in the sense of moving data from the D7, but rather a way that we populate some what we refer to as structural content. So we have these taxonomies that we use for a number of purposes. One of the main ones being anytime you have a select list in a piece of content, once you have content in it, you can't change the options within that select list. So the way we architect around that is creating a taxonomy and having that drop-down field point to that taxonomy, and that allows us to manage the options relatively easily. So we created the migration subsystem within Drupal is really very powerful, and so we are using that to populate those taxonomy terms that are used in some of the fields. In this case, we're pulling them from CSVs, if I'm not mistaken, Derek.
Yep.
Right, for these ones. And that, among other things, if I recall correctly, allows us to set the term ID so that when we have a something that references that value, we can map it to the terms. So why don't we take a look at what the CSV looks like, I guess, for this, right? Does that make sense? As a starting point, just for what the source is. So this is a standard CSV. In this case, we've got UUID and ID so that these things are stable within the system. And then these are just the categories for one or the other of the taxonomies we're using. I think it's how we're categorizing videos.
Video categories, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And then we've got the English and French labels. That's basically all there is there. Why don't we take a look at the, maybe from the front end, if we look at the migration groups, can we see the source piece of this? So
Is that what you
in
mean?
this case, yep, this is it. So in this case, what we're going to see here is just that the query, normally in a lot of cases, that's going to be a database query. In this case, it's just pointing to the fact that there's a CSV that we're going to be pulling this from. And then it's got the mapping of the machine names and descriptions, so the labels. This here is actually coming from our migration config. So why don't we switch back to the terminal and take a look at those. So migrations are configuration. They're configuration for the Migrate Plus module. And in this case, I believe this stuff is, this one might not be using the groups functionality very much.
Oh, you're right. You're right. Sorry, it is.
Most
of it is in the group. Yeah.
Yeah. So one of the things that Migrate Plus provides is this concept of migration groups. Now, in the UI, what that provides, if we can switch back to the UI for a minute and just go back to the groups listing, or the sort of default migrations list. We go one level up from them. So this is going to show all the groups. Okay. Within each group, there can be multiple migrations. And so in this case, I think it was the video category, right? So yeah, if we list the migrations, we'll then see that there are 2 migrations, an English and a French. And then it shows us the total number of items that are ready to migrate. And we have any logged messages basically related to a given migration once it's run. And in this case, we are specifying that these are English and French. What we'll see later on is that when you're migrating a multi-language site, you're going to want to migrate the original, the sort of source language, and then any translations as a second pass. It's a little bit complex, but that's basically how you handle that, because content can be created in French first and then translated into English. And so Drupal actually tracks that slightly differently, right? And so we want to model it properly when we're in terms of how it's created in the destination site. So in this case, if we come back to the terminal and look at one of these migrations, the migration groups not only provide this kind of aggregation of a set of migrations that are logically combined, they allow for these shared configuration. And so every migration within a group can leverage this shared configuration, so that if you have a bunch of migrations that are essentially the same, you can put all of your configuration into one place and deduplicate it as a result. And so what we see here is that the relevant pieces primarily are this source component, the process component, and the destination. So quickly zooming out for a minute in terms of how the migration system in Drupal works, the Migrate module, it's what's referred to as an ETL system. So E stands for extract, T stands for transform, and L stands for load. So you're in the migration terminology, the Migrate module terminology, the extract is the source. So this is how you get your data from wherever it is now. In this case, we're seeing that it's pointing at the particular CSV file that we're going to be pulling this data from. It's using the CSV plugin so that it knows what to do with it. And then we define each of the fields that exist in that CSV, giving it the machine name and then a label that we'll use. And then the IDs part is a way for us to trace back from this data what the IDs within Drupal that are created are. So we can do a lookup later on if we know an ID from the source. Sometimes it doesn't map exactly, and so there's ways to basically leverage this index, more or less, of the IDs to be able to track where the destination was. In our case, we're specifying the UUID and ID here. In some cases, we need to let it be the auto increment, and that's what this provides the ability to kind of look up. The process section maps to the transform part of the ETL model. And that's basically massaging the shape of the data that is from your source into the shape that the data needs to look like to be eventually loaded into the the entity that it's going to end up in. And so in this case, what we're doing is we've got the keys under process are the fields in taxonomy terms that we're going to be populating using the data that we're extracting from the fields above. So in this case, we've got a term ID. We're going to be using the ID field for that. The UUID is going to be using the UUID field for that. And then we're not specifying anything to do with the names yet. And then the line code is actually an automatic variable, I believe, that's provided by the fact that this is a internationalized site. And I believe there might be something a little bit further up in the config that specifies that. There's the line code here, but I think it's actually a different one that ends up being used. And then the destination is that load component. So this is what actually saves the this data into the destination sites database. In this case, it's going to be creating a taxonomy term, and thus there's a plugin specifically for how to do that. And then we specify what bundle it's going to use. So this particular taxonomy term is the SC video category taxonomy term. And so that's basically how this works. Let's quickly switch over to the migration itself, and we'll see what that looks like. Sure, we can look at the front
because it's more interesting.
Mm-hmm. So what we specify here is migration group. You'll see about a third of the way from the top. That references the config that we were just seeing before, and it provides inheritance essentially for the source, process, and destination components here. So whatever we saw in that migration group is also going to be available for us in the source, and we can override it as needed. So in this case, actually, can we look at the English one first? Because I think we're doing, this one is one of those cases where we're doing a lookup, right? So this one's very straightforward. It has the same migration group. The source line code we're specifying here is English. So that's what's being used in that process one I was mentioning earlier. We specify the name is coming from the name en field in that CSV file, and then we're not specifying any overrides at all for the destination. We're just going to use what's in the migration group configuration. Now let's switch to the French one again. This one's a little bit more complex because we have to handle the fact that this is the translated version. So in the source, we do specify that it's the French versions of these. In the term ID, this time, instead of pulling it directly out of the source, we're actually doing a migration lookup on the English version of this migration that will have run previously. We're passing it in the ID, and that's going to tell us what the term ID that was created was. So this is that example I was mentioning of how you can leverage a shared identifier between two different source data points and be able to map them together for in this case, right? And then the content translation source, we're basically just populating this with some detail here. Essentially what we're doing is we're saying the source language is English in this case. So here we're hard coding it, unlike what I referred to earlier about generally when it's content, you're going to want to have this not specified, right? Like that, whatever the translations are, whether they started out in English or French, let all the originals come in, and then all the translations come in a separate run. And then here we flag the name. In this case, we're using the French one, again coming out of that CSV source, and then we specify in the destination in this case that we're doing translations. And then we here specify that there's a migration dependency. The English one has to have run first. Because we're using this migration lookup to look up the term ID that was used, that migration has to have occurred. That generates what's referred to as a migration map table this is not something you're generally going to be interacting with directly, but it's a way for the Migrate system to keep track of all of the migrations that have happened previously. It allows for things like fast calculations of things like high watermarks. So in this case, we've got nine items in this CSV. If we were to go back and add 2 more, the migration system is smart enough to know that we've already migrated 9. We only have 2 remaining, right? And start from the 10th. So those are some of the things that the migration map table provides. And so if we were to execute these, I'm not sure if that's something we've tested doing from the UI, but actually this is already done as part of our
install, run from the install. Yeah.
Yeah, right. So in this case, we have, I believe in our hook install for the module, we actually run these migrations as a way to pre-populate these categories, right? So, so believe it or not, that was the simple example. Okay. Now we're going to start looking at some things that are a little bit more complex. So were there any specific ones, Derek, that you had thought would be a good example of this?
Well, I'm aware that we're short on time. So the callback collection thing seemed like sort of the next level of complexity.
Sure.
But then there's stuff like the user role map or extracting the release dates where we did the XPath stuff. I don't know where you want to jump to.
Yeah, so there's a lot of stuff that we've done in here. So can we maybe take a look at the list of the migrations, and maybe we can just quickly give an overview of sort of how these fit together. So all of this here right now is to migrate essentially one content type. We do multiple passes, and what we're doing is, among other things, you'll see there's a media paragraph. So we're migrating in media entities, and then we're embedding those in a paragraph so that translations work, because that's a thing in Drupal 9 that's you can't edit certain things in translations in a way that's particularly useful. So paragraphs really solves a lot of those problems. So we migrate in these media entities, then we create these paragraphs that embed those media entities, and then eventually we do the nodes that reference the media paragraphs. We do the same thing with what we refer to as a legacy paragraph. So because there's going to be some manual intervention required to do some cleanup after migrations, just verifying that the content looks the way it ought to in the new templates, we actually have this, what we're referring to as a legacy paragraph facade, which scrapes the original site and presents that as the content until an editor has had a chance to go in and see what the new templates look like. So that again is attached as a paragraph. So we have a migration that does that scraping of the public site to generate those paragraphs. We then have translations for each of these, because the source is both in English and in French. So we're doing our you'll see the way these are structured is WCMS product legacy paragraph, and then WCMS legacy paragraphs translations. And so there's that mapping pretty much across the board. We started out with videos because there were few in number, so it's easy to verify that the content was correct. There's like slightly less than 100 of those pages in total. But it also gave us an opportunity to kind of really build out the entire migration, like sort of the most complex type of migration, which in this case, as I mentioned, we need to migrate in paragraphs before the nodes that we attach those paragraphs to. And then in the case of the media paragraphs, we need to migrate in the media entities before we attach those to the paragraphs. And then before we migrate the media entities, we need to migrate the files that are attached to the media entities. So there's this whole chain of dependencies that have to be migrated in progressively in order to build up the eventual content that we have. A lot of this, when we're looking at it from a site build perspective, the end user is just creating a new file. They're uploading a video file. It's going to use something like inline entity form to embed, embed a paragraph, or use the paragraph module to embed rather those entities, and so forth, right? So from an end user standpoint, they're filling out one form and it ends up creating 5 or 10 entities behind the scenes. When we're doing the migrations, we actually have to map all of that out and do migrations for each and in the order that's required, so that the data that's being attached exists before it tries to be attached, right? Before we try to attach it somewhere. So that's basically the way that we built these out. If we look at one of these, maybe we can see some examples of how the plugins fit in. And each of these source, process, or destination components are represented as a plugin within Drupal, using the Drupal plugin system as a sort of way to announce its availability and so forth. Did we lose Derek's presentation? Oh, there we go. So the way that in some of these cases, because of the complexity of what we're mapping, we needed to do one of two things. So within the migration system, you can chain processes together in a pipeline. So you can have it say like downcase everything and then remove spaces, and then those kind of things can be chained together so that the end result is of the shape that you might want it to be. That gets complex to do when you're doing it in YAML, right? Because the configuration is YAML files. And so in a lot of cases, we found it was easier to just drop into PHP and run it directly. So the way we do that is by creating some custom plugins. In this case, yeah, let's take a look at some of these. So I think it was under Migrate. Right. And then which one do we want to look at? Let's do that one. I think that was relatively simple. Can you make the text bigger, Derek? Thank you. There, I think that should be reasonable. So this is basically a class where we inherit from these plugin base classes. In some cases, we can inherit from other ones, like higher up the chain. In this case, we're going pretty far down to this base plugin. You specify an ID. This is how you can find it and use it when needed. The tag on line 21 there, Migrate Process Plugin, is what allows the migration system to understand that this is a plugin available for us to use. And then the basic way that these work is you've got interfaces that are define the fact that you need a transform method, and a bunch of stuff is going to be passed into it. And we're then going to, so this is a process plugin. So the transform in that ETL model that we referred to earlier is the primary thing that we're going to execute as part of this plugin. And so in this case, let's see, do we have the map in here? I think we load it from configuration or something, right? So the challenge again is we're migrating from 2 different source sites, and only on one of these source sites, I believe, do we have we have different roles on each of these, and we need to merge them essentially. And in the new site, we didn't have as many roles. I believe we consolidated several of them. And so what we wanted to do was map those appropriately within the user migrations. So when we migrate the users, oh, here we go. So we specify the roles, we map them to the new roles within the system for the Drupal 9, and we pass that through this user role map plugin that we were just looking at. So this is actually configuration that gets piped into the into this plugin from the migration itself. And basically what it's doing is looking at the source data that's coming in and creating this map and outputting the, in this case, it's a machine name is how this is handled in Drupal 9, Drupal 8 as well, I believe, rather than role IDs. And so that was kind of what that mapping was for, is for that. And then what we return is a unique array. So if two source roles ended up being consolidated into one role in on the Drupal 9 site, we don't want to have two instances of that in the roles table. And so hence why we deduplicate the array in this case. So these are the kind of things that plugins can do for you. They just allow you to encode the logic that you want relatively easily, in comparison to trying to pipe this through multiple YAML configs to achieve the same thing. So we did that fairly frequently. We've got a number of these plugins that do this sort of thing. One of the more complex ones, well, there's a few. So we do a number of them that are using XPath to extract fields. Remember, the end result, or the source that we're coming from, is basically just HTML in a body field. So in order to map any of that content into fields, we needed to use XPath to parse it and extract that particular piece of data. And then that way we were able to dump it into a date field, right? But there was a number of things that had to happen. On the one hand, to extract it, and then later to transform it from a human date, readable date, because again, it's just HTML text at that point, into a timestamp, right? So we did that sort of thing. And then maybe we can, yeah, here's where we do some of the
so Christopher, just 2 minutes.
Sure. So listen, I'll leave it there. I think we've touched on sort of broadly the types of things that are involved in a complex migration like this. Hopefully, none of you are going to have to face a project quite so complex. But that said, the Migrate system was up for the task and remains up for the task. And a lot of this effort, while it went into migrating essentially 100 pages, greatly simplifies the other 17,000 that we still have, because it's a strong foundation upon which we can then build these other content types in the Drupal 9 and extract the appropriate data out of this unstructured data, essentially on the source side. So with that, I guess we have a minute for questions. More than happy to stick around a little bit later if need be to answer any questions that may come up.
Perfect. So why don't we? I'll just do a wrap up, and then if anyone would like to continue on past 1 o'clock, happy to have stay online a little bit longer. So I'm just going to take over the screen and then just put a highlight out for the follow-up to the session, because we knew it was too big a topic to cover in one. We have a panel that we're putting together. We want and need your questions to help guide this panel. We've got Suzanne from Evolving Web confirmed. We'll have someone from my team joining, and someone from Consensus joining as well. So we have opportunities to add follow-up questions, and maybe one of the folks over from Kalamuna, we might be able to have a join as well. So please do check out bit.ly.com/DTO-8. That'll take you to the survey. And we really value and need your feedback. It's really useful for the presenters to get some feedback from the audience, and it helps for us to plan out future meetups as well. And so we very much hope that you can join us next week at the exact same time for the follow-up panel talk. So thank you so much to Derek and Christopher for presenting. And thank you everyone who attending today. We love to have you join us, and hopefully you can join us next week. So if you got to go, please do just hop off. But if you want to stick around and ask some questions, please do just stay on, and then we'll take a look at it, because and we can run through those over the next couple minutes. Thank you very much, everyone. Awesome. So Christopher, I got a question to kick it off.
Sure.
The sequence, right, where we've got all these different entities, file to media to the content type migrating across. Do you have any suggestions or recommendations for what is the process you go through to deal with that? So, you know, say there's 2 media fields on a content type, you know, or even perhaps things like a circular reference, right? Where like maybe something refers to a taxonomy that is used in 2 media types, something like that. Do you have any tips or suggestions on how to deal with the potential confusion that could be there?
Take your time. I think I don't think there's an easy answer. I mean, Derek, feel free to add anything, but a lot of what we started with was kind of mocking things that we knew we didn't need to deal with right away. So like users, for example, was a good example of that, where we just initially set all the user IDs to user 1. And then that allowed us to focus on the content, because of course users have to be there to populate the author field, right? So we basically just left off a bunch of the fields initially, right? And we just mapped in the fields that we were most concerned with, the things that were the most challenging, and that's what led to sort of being able to focus on the chain of requirements that would get us to this eventual state, right? And then everything else is easy in comparison, right? Like, so when you then decide to go back and migrate your users, you just undo the like hard coding of user 1 in your migrations, you add the user migration, and then now you're doing that. But by starting with the hard parts, it also speeds up the cycle, right? Because there's a fair amount of testing required and trial and error to make sure you're getting things into the state that you want them to be in. And so if you're migrating all of the easy stuff as part of those migrations, there's just a huge amount of time wasted on things you know are working. So you work on the high risk stuff early on, and then that way you've got as little cruft sort of as part of that development cycle as possible. And then as you're working on the other ones, it's just that much easier because the hard stuff is already in place, and you've put those components into migrations already. Derek, do you have anything you wanted to add?
I'll jump in. Yeah, I have a couple of thoughts. Certainly, in general, taking the approach of making the migration config as minimal as possible to get it to work, like literally just migrate a title field initially, right? And then sort of build up from there. The other thing that comes to mind in terms of sort of the dependency chain, there's some stuff built into core. We've found that it's doesn't always work the way we'd like. So that migration dependencies stuff that you can put at the bottom of the configs is somewhat helpful. There's a couple, I think it's called like Migrate Manifest. There's a module out there that allows you to just create a list of the migrations that you want to run in the right order, and then it will do that. We simulate essentially that thing in our make files. So what Christopher was talking about, the way we set up make targets, this was a key use of that, right? Where we just have a make target that's like make import nodes, and that lists all of the things that need to come first in order to get to nodes. And that, you know, that ordering definitely evolves over time. So we would sort of shift it around as new things emerged that we would need to take care of, right? So that's all.
Polishing the diamond. So Nick and Nathan, you both, everyone, please feel welcome to just come off of mute and ask any questions you've got.
Sure. Hi, guys. Question. You mentioned something about source languages and them complicating things. And we're in the process of migration from D7 to D8. For pages, it's not such a big deal for that because we figured out a way. But when we're migrating books, this seems to cause a big problem because in the old system, some people would create the book in English and then book pages start in French. Have you figured out a way to get through that or somehow normalize it so all the sources are English? Any thoughts on that?
The key thing for us, so we were able to sort of ignore that detail here because we validated early on that all of the content was originally created in English, and so we were able to kind of simplify it down to always assume that English was the source language. But in other cases, what it's come down to is just building the migration so that we don't assume the language of the source. We just say the initial migration is the source and pull the lang code from that source data. Just tell Drupal, give me source nodes, tell me what lang code it is, and then migrate that in. And then your second migration is translations, and you say, now give me the translations of those nodes. You do that migration lookup trick to get the node ID to match, and then again set lang code. That's the crux of it.
Yeah, that's what we've been doing. But yeah, so for books, it gets really complicated because apparently the menu link IDs get all weird if on that. I don't know. We're going through it right now. We'll let you know if we have any maybe next
Great. I can imagine book with hierarchy and menus hooked in is gonna make extra complication for sure.
Yeah, so far we've reverted for pages to like a manual process where when we flip around the source nodes, some fields don't map correctly, and we just say like go in and fix these 10 nodes. But for books, it's more complicated. Anyway, thanks.
Yep. Nathan?
Yes, hello, Nathan here. So I used to work on this project a while ago, so it's great to see how far it's come. My question is, now with Drupal 7 extended support going all the way even to 2025, what's the appetite for really trying to focus on extracting business value and shipping the the feature? You have this migration with, let's say, this one video content type. Are you able to ship just that and then run Drupal 7 and I guess 9 at the same time, and then slowly chip away at the problem until that extended support end of life? Or is it like more of a rush to just, technically complete the project, even if the end result is still Dreamweavery?
Yeah,
Go ahead, Christopher.
Sure. So the original
I need to turn off the recording.
Okay, yep, that's fine. The original architecture we had put in place was intended to have this phased approach, right? We migrate in some data that actually goes live at the ingress point. We do some routing to point at the appropriate site. So we have the D7 and the D9 running in parallel. Any content that's on the D9 is considered canonical, and if it doesn't exist on the D9, then it falls back to the D7. And so that way, as we migrate content into the D9, it takes over more and more of the traffic as that content exists there. And essentially, the Drupal 7 is intended to sort of dry up, essentially, more or less, for the traffic on there. That is the original plan. The plan was to create basically the equivalent of this basic page for a number of these content types, because there's a lot of them. There's sort of a long tail. There's about 10 or 12 that are commonly used, and there's a lot of content in them. And then there's a lot of them that are kind of one-offs, or 2 or 3 of them. And so for those ones, the intention was, recall we have this legacy paragraph that kind of scrapes the screen and just presents that as a snapshot of the page. The intention was essentially build a content type that can then just be cloned and create that in repeatedly for each of the new content types. That sets us up to be able to then customize them if there's a call for doing so down the road, but it also reduces the effort up front. That results in something like 80 or 90 content types. Like there's a lot here, but it's 20,000 pages. So that was the original architecture. I believe now there's some discussion about breaking that one-to-one relationship, which I personally think is going to cause more trouble down the road. It will save effort up front if they were to do it that way, but I think it's if the goal is to sort of have it be as easy to use long term and provide as much business value that it would be to do it that way. But again, there are challenges. You know, these are public funds being used in this case, right? For this, so we can't just polish it to our heart's content. We need to get it to the point where it's something that can be can go live, move the content over as quickly as possible. So there are organizational constraints and budget constraints that are driving some decisions on this that, you know, if I had my way, I would suggest they didn't, but that's, you know, that's the reality of the situation. I'm not sure I answered your question, Nathan, but I
yeah,
hope
I think so. I mean, this is kind of like a really common issue in I find in public institutions is they look at things in terms of projects as opposed to like a continuous improvement, even though, like, technically speaking, when you look at the evolution from Drupal 7 to like Drupal 8/9/10, we're going from, you know, like people were instigating large projects to move from 6 to 7 and 7 to 8. But then now with this end of life to 2025, I think it makes a lot of sense to iteratively do it. Like in the end game, yes, like the constraint on the project, you can't, let's say it looks like it's an overcosting of that budget. But if you look at the total life cycle of the project, it's a lot cheaper to just iteratively improve something and keep on shipping something. So I think this is like a growing pains that Drupal is going through right now. Yes, I'm a little editorializing your answer. Hopefully I've added some value as well.
I think as someone who works in government, I think, yeah, there's a lot of projects instead of products. I know where we work, we're trying to get away from the old model where suddenly there's time to do something and let's invest a lot of money to do it, instead of sort of continuously developing on something. It's a mindset in government. It's hard to change. We do have things like digital first assessments where we try to, you know, say that, you know, we should be taking agile products, multidisciplinary team approaches to things. So hopefully that'll change, at least in Ontario, in the government. We're trying to lead that good fight.
Yeah, I think totally. Like if you look at a lot of projects, like a lot of the players who are actively day to day, they're interested in going to a product model. But then when the knife comes down, it's like, well, it was we approved the project. So it's like, you're trying to like kind of shoehorn the budgetary system to make it work for products. But ultimately, when it comes up to like, you know, Queen's Park, I guess in your case, Nick, or like the actual government budgetary process, they're so focused on, you know, everything is like building a bridge almost. Yeah. And they like
I can comment on corporate world where it's also the same. Like, it's not just government, government public projects.
We all want that dream client that just keeps giving us money to make cool things.
Unlimited dollars forever. Like, yeah, yes.
Doesn't always happen. I had that once at a startup where we were working with Best Buy and they would just keep throwing us money for things. And we were just like, all right, I guess we'll build this. Okay, we'll do this.
Amazing.
It's a lot cheaper, right? It's a lot cheaper to do that iterative process. That's like what people don't realize, because if you have that waterfall process, it's like you turn it on and you're praying more than you want to.
Gantt chart is very, very confidence building. You're like, look at all these lines. They are predictable. We know exactly what's going to happen next. Yeah.
One last thing I'll add to this, just to commiserate with you, is the challenge of with this product approach, you know, teams scale up and something gets built and then teams scale down and you have a huge knowledge loss there, right? Whether it's people leave the organization or the documentation is lost or someone hands you a giant binder and says, this is how it was set up. Having a product approach and sort of continuous iteration is, you know, much better for that way too. Yeah, I feel you.
Perfect. Awesome. Well, I think that we should wrap it up for today. So thank you very much, everyone. And thanks again for an awesome presentation. And I look forward to hopefully everyone can join us next week. So have a great weekend, everyone. Take care.
Absolutely. Thank you all.
Thanks, folks.
Thank you.
Take care.